The United States wins its independence 1763-89. The year 1763 marked the high point in friendly relations between Great Britain and the American colonies. The long series of wars against the French had tied the two closely together. The colonists wanted and received the help of British armies to protect them from New France and its indigenous allies. At the same time, Britain needed colonial soldiers and supplies to carry on its activities in the New World. For more than 150 years, the colonies had been developing their own society, economic life, and some self-government. The mother country had offered little direction and almost no interference in colonial affairs. After the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the policy changed. Britain began enforcing restrictions on American trade and on manufacturing. Direct taxes were levied on the colonists. The Americans resented the new policies. The colonies had a long history of representative government that had begun with the creation of Virginia's House of Burgesses in 1619, and they felt that only the colonial assemblies had the right to tax them. For a long time, the colonists did not ask for independence. They asked only for their rights and liberties as English citizens. King George III and his ministers answered by passing ever stricter measures. They sent over more troops to enforce these laws. Gradually, many of the colonists began to realize that the only solution lay in complete independence. British laws. Anger the colonists, those. British Parliament passed the first law directly aimed at collecting money from the colonies in 1764. It was the Sugar Act. This raised the duties on certain imports and added many products to the taxed list. Later that year, another measure regulated currency in the colonies. Leading citizens in Massachusetts founded a committee of correspondence to unify opposition to these laws. In 1765, two laws brought even greater resentment. A Quartering Act forced Americans to furnish housing and supplies for British troops. A Stamp Act levied a direct tax on newspapers, licenses, legal documents, and other business papers. James Otis of Massachusetts and Patrick Henry of Virginia raised their voices against these measures. The Stamp Act Congress, attended by representatives of 9 colonies, met in New York City. It protested against taxation by the British Parliament, in which the colonies were not represented. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, but new taxes were enacted the next year. These were the Townshend Acts, levying taxes on glass, lead paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. Again, Americans protested heatedly, and in 1770 all the Townshend Acts were repealed except the tax on tea. Meanwhile, new trouble flared up in Massachusetts and elsewhere. There was increasing friction between Americans and British soldiers. In Boston, British troops fired on a crowd, killing 5 people. This was the so-called Boston Massacre of 1770. In 1771 and 1772, tension between the colonies and the mother country relaxed somewhat. Then in 1773 began the chain of events that led directly to war. Early in the year, the British Parliament passed a new Tea Act. This refueled the fires of colonial opposition. In New York City and Philadelphia, the people refused to accept tea shipped into these ports. On December 16th, Boston patriots, dressed as indigenous people, boarded British ships in the harbor. They dumped 342 chests of tea into the water to protest the British tax on tea. The Boston Tea Party marked the first act of open resistance to British rule. To punish the colonies, Britain passed 5 coercive acts in 1774. The 4 intolerable acts closed the port of Boston, limited self-government in Massachusetts, allowed British officials accused of crimes in America to stand trial in Britain, and ordered the colonies to furnish additional quarters for British troops. The 5th Act extended the southern boundary of Quebec to the Ohio River. The colonies bitterly protested the intolerable acts. In the fall, they sent representatives to the First Continental Congress at Philadelphia. The Congress declared the intolerable acts unjust and unconstitutional. It planned to meet again the next year if further action became necessary. The war begins. 1775. The first battles of the American Revolution took place on April 19th, 1775, in Massachusetts. On the night of April 18th, British troops left Boston to seize colonial military supplies stored at Concord, 21 miles, 34 kilometers away. Warned by Paul Revere and others, colonial Minutemen assembled with their guns along the route of the march. Early in the morning, the British forces killed 8 patriots at Lexington and wounded 10 more. They then marched on to Concord. The supplies were destroyed, but here the Americans fought back. The war to end colonialism had begun. The next month, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold captured Fort Ticonderoga at the foot of Lake Champlain. That same day, May 10th, the Second Continental Congress met at Philadelphia to take charge of the war. The Congress appointed George Washington commander-in-chief of the Continental Forces. Before Washington reached Boston, British troops had defeated American soldiers at Bunker Hill outside the city. The colonial forces won fame, however, for the courage and skill they showed against the trained troops of England. For details of the fighting, see American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence, along with the early military action, came a growing desire for a complete break from Britain. One of the first to make an open call for independence was Thomas Paine of Philadelphia. His sharp attacks on King George III in his pamphlet Common Sense did much to arouse public opinion. In April, North Carolina instructed its delegates to the Congress to vote for independence. Virginia did the same in May. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, it adopted one of the greatest documents in history, the Declaration of Independence. The document had been prepared chiefly by Thomas Jefferson. In 1777, the British started a major plan to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. A force of British and German troops under General John Burgoyne marched southward from Canada into Upper New York. The Americans stopped the attack in 3 battles, and on October 17th, Burgoyne was forced to surrender at Saratoga, New York. This was the turning point in the American Revolution. Final victory at Yorktown during the next 3 years, 1778 to 1781, American and British forces continued to fight, but neither side could gain a distinct advantage. The colonies won several notable victories. They secured an alliance with France. John Paul Jones fought well at sea, and George Rogers Clark took control of the Northwest. There were also severe setbacks. An attack on Newport, Rhode Island, failed. Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, fell to the British. And Benedict Arnold turned traitor. Finally, in the summer of 1781, a decisive battle began to take shape in Virginia. Lord Cornwallis moved his large British army up from the Carolinas to Yorktown. Here, Washington and the French commander Lafayette concentrated their land forces. At sea, help came from the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse. Together, they bottled up the British in the peninsula between the York and the James Rivers. On October 19th, after a siege of several weeks, Cornwallis surrendered. This ended the fighting and secured the freedom of the United States. The peace treaty, drawn up at Paris, France, was accepted by both nations in 1783. The terms recognized the full independence of the United States. It established the nation's boundaries as Canada on the north, the Mississippi River on the west, and Florida, which had been ceded back to Spain by Great Britain, on the south. The United States now faced the problem of establishing a just and stable government of its own. The strength of the new nation rested almost entirely upon the 13 state governments. The only central government agency had been the Continental Congress. In 1781, this organization was replaced by the first true national government. It was organized under the Articles of Confederation, which had been ratified by all the states. Government under the Confederation. In the new national government, each state had 1 vote in Congress. 9 votes were necessary to pass a law. Law enforcement and the administration of justice were left to the states. The states also received all powers not specifically granted to Congress. The lack of a strong central authority made the government only a league of loosely tied states that were virtually independent nations. Congress could not collect taxes, regulate commerce, or settle disputes among the states. Its work was further handicapped by the people's lack of feeling for national unity. Most Americans still owed their first loyalties to their home state. In addition, the almost 4 million residents of the new country were widely scattered from Maine to Georgia. Transportation and communication were poor between settlements and worse between states. The country suffered a business depression following the Revolution. The prices of farm products fell 20%, money was scarce, and local taxes high. In western Massachusetts, Daniel Shays led a revolt of poor farmers against the government. Shays's rebellion was one of several disturbances in different states that helped advance support for a stronger national government. Despite its weaknesses, the Confederation government was successful in solving the complex problem of how to deal with the western lands between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. The states themselves provided help. They ceded to Congress most of their claims to western territories. Congress then privatized the lands through the Northwest Ordinance of 1785. This law divided government-owned land into townships 6 miles square. The townships in turn were subdivided into 36 numbered sections of 1 square mile, 640 acres each. These lands were then sold at auction at a minimum price of $1 an acre. Government for the region was provided by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This document ranks next in importance to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It created the territory northwest of the Ohio, from which new states could be created. The U.S. Constitution. The events of the years 1781 to 1787, including the national government's inability to act during Shays's rebellion, showed that the Articles of Confederation were unworkable. They deprived the national government of many essential powers, including direct taxation and the ability to regulate commerce between the states. To address the government's weaknesses, all the states, but Rhode Island, sent delegates to Philadelphia in 1787 for the Constitutional Convention. The convention was officially called only to amend the Articles of Confederation. But, after much debate and compromise, the delegates drafted a new document under which the United States has been governed ever since. By June 1788, 9 states had ratified the Constitution, making it the new law of the land. During the constitutional debate, many Americans expressed concern that the document did not guarantee the freedoms they had fought for in the Revolution. Several states agreed to ratify the Constitution only after being assured that a Bill of Rights would be added. Congress proposed 12 amendments in 1789. 10 were ratified by the states. They make up the Bill of Rights, which would be adopted on December 15, 1791. The Constitution created a strong federal government. To protect against abuses of government power, the framers of the Constitution divided the government into 3 separate and independent bodies: the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. A system of checks and balances allows each branch to prevent actions by the other branches. This balance of power was designed to preserve the liberty of citizens. To address the economic problems of the Confederation period, the Constitution gave Congress, the legislative branch, great power over economic and financial affairs. It authorized Congress to levy taxes, to borrow money, and to coin money and regulate its value. It also gave Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce while limiting the power of states to restrict such trade. In this way, the Constitution prevented states from placing tariffs and other burdens on the shipping of their neighbors, which had caused heavy losses and much resentment. In effect, these provisions established the United States as a common market. The leading advocate of the common market at the Constitutional Convention was Alexander Hamilton. He argued that every state, and the United States as a whole, would benefit from the free flow of goods throughout the country. After the French and Indian War, proclamation of 1763. The year is 1763. The echoes of war have finally quieted. After nearly a decade of brutal fighting, the Great 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, has come to an end. Britain stands victorious. France has surrendered vast territories: Canada, the Mississippi Valley, and lands east of the Mississippi River. For the first time, the British flag flies proudly over nearly all of eastern North America. But victory brought more than glory. It brought debt, responsibility, and trouble. The war had cost Britain a fortune. The empire had doubled its debt, and now faced the challenge of protecting and governing a massive new frontier stretching thousands of miles to keep peace with Native American nations, many of whom had fought alongside the French. Britain issued a royal decree, the Proclamation of 1763, order of His Majesty King George III. All settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains is hereby forbidden. To London, the order made perfect sense. It was meant to prevent costly wars with native nations. But to the colonists, it felt like betrayal. They saw it as proof that the crown cared more for imperial control than for colonial freedom. In that moment, a small crack appeared in the bond between Britain and her colonies, a crack that would soon split wide open. The seeds of revolution had been planted, not by muskets or slogans, but by a line drawn on a map. And so, from the ashes of victory in 1763, the story of American independence began. The war for empire was over. The struggle for liberty was just beginning. British Taxes and Acts, 1764-1774. The victory over France had made Britain the master of a vast empire, but an empire that came with a heavy price tag. The treasury was drained, the war debt enormous, and the British government looked across the Atlantic to its colonies for relief. At first, the plan seemed reasonable. The colonies had benefited from British protection during the war, so perhaps they could help pay for it. But the way Britain chose to collect that money would spark outrage, resistance, and rebellion. In 1764 came the Sugar Act, a tax on imported sugar, molasses, and other goods. To London, it was a minor adjustment. To the colonists, it was a dangerous precedent, Parliament taxing them without their consent. Then, in 1765, the Stamp Act struck. Every newspaper, contract, and legal document now required an official stamp, proof that the tax had been paid. It was the first direct tax on the colonists, and it hit every class of society. Protests erupted from New England to the Carolinas. Mobs gathered, effigies of tax collectors burned in the streets, and the cry rang out, "No taxation without representation." To many colonists, the issue was not money, it was principle. They had no representatives in Parliament. If they could be taxed without a voice, what power did they have left? The uproar forced Britain to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, but the victory was short-lived. The same day, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, insisting it still had full authority to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear. Britain would not back down. In 1767 came the Townshend Acts, placing new duties on imported goods: glass, paper, paint, tea. Customs officers were empowered to search homes and ships for smuggled goods. The colonies answered with boycotts, petitions, and defiance. Tension turned to blood in 1770, when British soldiers fired into a crowd in Boston, the event that would be remembered as the Boston Massacre. 5 colonists lay dead, and the outrage spread like wildfire. Though most of the Townshend duties were later repealed, one tax remained, on tea, a symbol of Parliament's control. In 1773, The Tea Act granted the struggling British East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting local merchants. In Boston, furious patriots responded by boarding ships and dumping 342 chests of British tea into the harbor. The act of defiance became legend, the Boston Tea Party. Britain's response was swift and severe. Parliament passed the coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor and placing Massachusetts under direct royal rule. What had begun as a debate over taxes had become a struggle over freedom itself. By 1774, the colonies stood on the edge of open rebellion, and the empire that had once seemed unshakable was beginning to crack. Resistance and the road to revolution, 1774 to 1775. The year is 1774. The British Empire believes it can crush defiance with punishment. But in the colonies, the coercive acts, the so-called intolerable acts, have lit a fire that cannot be contained. From Massachusetts to Virginia, outrage spreads like sparks in dry grass. If Britain can shut down Boston, what city will be next? In response, the colonies do something extraordinary. They unite. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gather in Philadelphia that September, forming the First Continental Congress, a meeting of men who, only a few years earlier, might have called themselves loyal subjects of the king. Now, they speak of rights, liberty, and resistance. They petition the crown, demand the repeal of the intolerable acts, and declare that only their own assemblies can tax them. But beneath the polite language of resolutions, there is defiance, a growing conviction that words alone will no longer be enough. Across New England, militias begin to drill in open fields. Blacksmiths hammer out musket parts by lantern light. In secret barns and meeting houses, powder and shot are gathered, ready for the fight that everyone senses is coming. The king's ministers see rebellion brewing. British troops are ordered to enforce the law and to disarm the colonies before open war can begin. In the dark hours before dawn on April 19, 1775, red-coated soldiers march from Boston toward the nearby town of Concord. Their mission, seize colonial weapons, but word travels faster than their march. Riders thunder down the road shouting, "The regulars are coming out." At Lexington Green, a small band of local militia, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, stand their ground. No one knows who fired the first shot, but in an instant, smoke fills the air and the first blood of the American Revolution is spilled. The British push on to Concord, where they are met by hundreds more armed colonists. From behind stone walls and trees, the militia fires back. As the redcoats retreat toward Boston, the road becomes a gauntlet of gunfire, a deadly message that the age of submission is over. The world has changed. The British Empire, the mightiest on earth, now faces a war not just against an army, but against an idea, the belief that ordinary people can govern themselves. In the spring of 1775, the road to revolution becomes the road to independence. The colonies are no longer just resisting British rule. They are beginning to imagine a new nation. The year is 1776. For more than a year, the colonies have been at war with the greatest empire on earth. Yet still, they have not declared themselves free. The guns have fired at Lexington and Concord, at Bunker Hill and beyond. George Washington commands the Continental Army, struggling against hunger, cold, and doubt. But even as muskets flash and cannon roar, the question lingers. Are they fighting for their rights as British citizens, or for something far greater? Oh, in Philadelphia, that question comes to life inside the sweltering hall of the Second Continental Congress. Delegates from 13 colonies gather once more, debating their future with passion and fear. Independence. The word itself hangs heavy in the air. To break from Britain is treason. If they fail, every man in the room could hang for it. Yet the tide of history cannot be stopped. The war, the bloodshed, the king's refusal to compromise, all point to one conclusion. It is no longer reconciliation they seek. It is freedom. In June, Virginia's Richard Henry Lee rises and offers a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The motion electrifies the chamber. A committee is formed to put this daring idea into words. Among them, a tall, quiet Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. For days, Jefferson writes. By candlelight, he drafts a statement unlike any the world has ever seen. A declaration not just of independence, but of human rights. He writes of liberty, of equality, and of a people's right to choose their own government. We hold these truths to be self-evident, he begins, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress votes, and the colonies become free states in name. 2 days later, on July the 4th, the delegates formally adopt the Declaration of Independence. Church bells ring, cannons thunder. In towns and cities across America, the words are read aloud to cheering crowds. The people know what it means. The old world is gone, but freedom will not come easily. The British Army still occupies their cities. Their navy commands the seas. Ahead lies sacrifice, hardship, and years of war. Still, with this declaration, the colonies have crossed a line from which there is no return. They have declared not just separation, but revolution. And in doing so, they have given birth to an idea that will echo through the ages, that a nation can be built on liberty, equality, and the consent of the governed. The United States of America has been born, not by the sword alone, but by the courage to put freedom into words. The War for Independence, 1776-1783, the Declaration has been signed. The words have been spoken. Now they must be defended. In the summer of 1776, British warships fill New York Harbor, their sails blackening the horizon. An army of redcoats, the finest soldiers in the world, prepares to crush the rebellion once and for all. They outnumber, outgun, and outtrain the ragged Americans who stand against them. George Washington, commander of the Continental Army, faces his greatest test. He knows that one decisive defeat could end the revolution before it truly begins. The British strike hard. They drive Washington's forces from New York, across New Jersey, and toward the Delaware River. Winter closes in. Cold, hunger, and despair follow. Many soldiers desert. Others march barefoot through snow stained with blood. But Washington refuses to surrender. On a freezing Christmas night, 1776, he leads a daring surprise attack across the icy Delaware. At dawn, the Americans strike the Hessian garrison at Trenton and win. A week later, they triumph again at Princeton. These small victories rekindle hope. The revolution lives, yet the war is far from won. The British launch new campaigns, sweeping through New York, New Jersey, and the South. The Americans suffer defeats, shortages, and constant struggle. But through the hardship, a new army and a new nation begins to take shape. Then, in 1777, fortune turns. At Saratoga, American forces under General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold defeat a major British army. It is a stunning victory, and the world takes notice. Across the Atlantic, France, long Britain's rival, sees its chance. In 1778, France formally allies with the United States, sending troops, ships, and money. Spain and the Netherlands soon follow. What began as a colonial rebellion becomes a global war. Meanwhile, in the icy huts of Valley Forge, Washington's army endures a brutal winter. Snow drifts through cracked cabins. Disease and hunger claim hundreds. But under the training of Baron von Steuben, the ragged soldiers are transformed into a disciplined force. By spring, they emerge stronger, united, and determined. Years of battle follow, from the northern forests to the southern swamps. In the Carolinas, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, harasses British troops with hit-and-run attacks. In the north, Washington maneuvers carefully, waiting for the right moment to strike a final blow. That moment comes in 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis marches his army into Yorktown, Virginia, expecting reinforcements by sea, but the French fleet blocks the Chesapeake Bay, trapping him. Washington and French General Rochambeau move in from the north, surrounding Yorktown with cannon and troops. For 3 weeks, the Allies bombard the British lines. On October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrenders. The news spreads like wildfire. The war is effectively won. Though small battles continue, the fighting is nearly over. In 1783, diplomats gather in Paris to sign the Treaty of Paris. Britain recognizes the independence of the United States. The long, bitter struggle, fought across rivers, mountains, and oceans, has ended in victory. The cost has been enormous. Thousands dead, cities burned, families torn apart. But from the sacrifice comes something new. A nation built not by kings, but by the courage of its people. In 1776, they declared their independence. In 1783, they secured it. The 13 colonies have become the United States of America, a republic born of war, sustained by hope, and destined to test the very meaning of freedom. From Confederation to Constitution, 1783-1789, the war is over. The Treaty of Paris has been signed. The British are gone. The United States stands free at last. But peace, the founders soon discover, brings its own battles. For 8 long years, the colonies fought side by side for independence. Now, in victory, they must learn how to govern themselves. 13 new states, proud, independent, and wary of central authority, must somehow act as one. Their first attempt comes in the form of the Articles of Confederation, a document born of fear as much as hope. It creates a government, but one deliberately weak. A single Congress, no president, no national court, and no power to tax. The new nation is free, but fragile. At first, the mood is triumphant. The people rejoice. The soldiers return home. The revolution, it seems, has succeeded, but soon the cracks appear. Without money or strong central authority, the government cannot pay its debts. The army goes unpaid, trade falters, and states quarrel over borders and taxes. Each acts in its own interest, printing its own currency, passing its own laws. By the mid-1780s, the promise of liberty begins to tremble under the weight of chaos. Farmers, crushed by debt and high taxes, rise up in protest, most famously in Shays' Rebellion of 1786. Armed men march on courthouses demanding relief. To many leaders, it is a terrifying sign. The revolution may have freed them from tyranny, but could it now dissolve into anarchy? Across the states, a question grows louder. Has liberty gone too far to survive? In 1787, a call goes out for a convention in Philadelphia, meant at first to revise the Articles. But when the delegates gather that May, they realize the task before them is greater. The old system cannot be repaired. A new foundation must be built. Behind closed doors, they debate through the sweltering summer. Voices clash, tempers flare, compromises are forged. Large states demand representation by population. Small states demand equality. Southern delegates insist on protecting slavery. Others denounce it as a stain on liberty. Out of conflict and compromise emerges a bold new vision, a constitution that balances power between the people and their government, between the states and the nation, a president to execute the laws, a Congress to make them, a Supreme Court to interpret them, and within it all, a delicate system of checks and balances designed to prevent tyranny while ensuring stability. On September 17, 1787, after months of debate, 39 weary delegates signed the final document. It is sent to the states for ratification. The battle shifts from the convention hall to the newspapers and taverns, where Federalists and Anti-Federalists wage a war of words. The Federalists argue for unity and strength, that only a strong central government can preserve the hard-won liberty. The Anti-Federalists fear that same power could destroy it. They demand guarantees of individual rights. In 1788, the Constitution is ratified. A year later, on March 4, 1789, the new government takes its place in history. George Washington, the man who led the army to victory, now takes an oath as the first president of the United States. Soon after, to fulfill the promise of liberty, the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments protecting speech, religion, and justice, is added to the Constitution. And so, out of revolution and reason, out of war and compromise, a new nation truly begins. The United States of America, a fragile experiment in self-government, steps onto the stage of history. Born of rebellion, bound by law, and guided by the belief that freedom, once claimed, must forever be defended.